The Unpublished Book of the Ocean, Chapter 1, The Kelp Forest. The kelp forest hides secrets. One stringy plant will whisper them to the next. One generation will pass them on to the next before dissolving, being eaten, or floating away. The whispers, the secrets, and the knowledge of 1,000 generations drift thickly through the kelp forest. Red swimmers and blue swimmers who linger there too long go mad, forget to eat, forget to swim, only suspend themselves in the beautiful silent songs of the kelp. There are floor-sitters who consider the forest to be sacred, who sit upon the ocean bottom, talking to the roots of the kelp for many lightnesses at a time. They feel it is their life's duty to inform the leafy giants of the important ocean events as they see them. These floor-sitters claim the eldest kelp keep the records in history of the whole ocean. But all swimmers, all middle swimmers, consider the floor-sitters to be foolish and arrogant. They tell the roots only of their own families and are often fed upon by the kelp forest's only other permanent inhabitant, the furry wizards. Once every current change, their larger cousins, the naked wizards, arrive and purge the kelp of any swimmers who dare to go near the forest. These naked wizards are mindless creatures. Ask any swimmer. They communicate with no one, not even their cousins, the furry wizards. After all, communication is what separates intelligent sea creatures from the plants. Or so it is believed in the royal courts of the sea kings, where philosophical debates are always being waged about what creatures were intelligent and the best way to classify the king's subjects. On this day, a floor-sitter has just completed an oration of 200 likenesses to the root of a grand kelp. The sitter's name cannot be pronounced by any being with a mouth and lungs. If one could feel a rush of water, then a staccato vibration, accompanied by an almost imperceptible drop in pressure, that would be its name. But for the sake of understanding, we'll use a word from a kelp tongue, for they speak thousands of languages and understand tens of thousands. Feldper let his hundreds of quills rest after vibrating them thoughtfully for the better part of a current change. It had observed something strange across the sky of the ocean 220 lightnesses ago. It traveled for 20 lightnesses to reach the short distance to where its friend, the grand kelp, grew and began telling the story. Bottom-sitters had two languages. One they used for communicating with the kelp, and the other was for emergencies and can express complex ideas almost instantaneously. For this occasion, Feldper used the prior one. The forest would self-sustain for hundreds of thousands of current changes. There was no need to hurry. The kelp always had time to listen. Feldper felt satisfaction in having recorded the event. Its small contribution would last forever in the collective memory of the forest. As Feldper rested, it took a moment to ingest a microscopic speck of seagrass. The nutrients tingled inside its tiny digestive tract. Indeed, it wasn't it, for floor-sitters had no gender and simply butted off their lone parent. It listened through the vibrations of the water to the sweet uttering of the kelp. The hushed murmurings changed tone slightly, as if in foreboding. Feldper listened on. It wondered how the ocean began. Perhaps if it just listened intently enough, it could distinguish one kelp tongue from another, pick out its own language, and learn the mysteries of the ages. What was that? It could hear something distinctive through the multilingual song. The pressure began to drop rapidly. It could feel its body expand, and then with a sudden rush of water and terror, it broke through the sky of the ocean, bubbles shattering upon its quills. Feldper knew what was happening now. A furry wizard had snatched Feldper from the ocean floor and dashed back up to the ocean sky. It clenched the trembling floor-sitter tightly. Feldper became aware of a terrible snapping and undulating in its emergency language, a terrified, "What are you doing?" The furry wizard understood, amazingly enough, and responded, "I'm breaking off your spines. I don't like that part." "Breaking off my spines?" Its panic faded into a dull ache. If only it could have seen its own demise coming, it could have at least mentally prepared for death. The wizard snapped 2 more spines, sending great shivers of pain through Feldper's body, then suddenly ceased the work of death. Drunken with horrified hysteria, Feldper asked, "Why have you stopped?" The wizard rested his broken lunch on his belly as he floated calmly on his back. He groomed his whiskers thoughtfully and replied, "I am going to eat you." He delicately placed a detached spine in his mouth, crunched it, and spat it into the water before continuing, "But I'm not entirely heartless. If you need a moment to collect your thoughts before I continue, then I will wait." "Thank you," Feldper offered pitifully. What to think about in the final moments of one's mortal existence? It was such an unexpected proposition. Collect its thoughts, indeed. 1,000 thoughts had already crossed its mind, but none helped it escape the feeling of a condemned prisoner waiting for the sentence to be carried out. What a stupid, mangy wizard. He was just trying to make it harder. Well, it wasn't going to give him the satisfaction. "All right, then," Feldper said with disdain. "So soon?" the wizard said, surprised. "Very well." He began to squeeze its fleshy body into his mouth, then stopped and pulled it out again. If Feldper had eyes, it would have rolled them in that moment. "Get on with it already." "So long as you're about to die," the wizard said matter-of-factly, "I should tell you. A great war is about to begin, not unlike the one before the ocean cooled. Be grateful. You won't have to witness it." Feldper had heard of the ancient war through the Kelp, but it happened tens of thousands of likenesses ago. But how did he know about it? The fuzzy mammal continued, "The sea creatures that breathe air are going to rise up against those that breathe water. All treaties will be broken. Billions will die. It will begin with the treachery of the Skybreakers." "But they are sworn to the same king as I am. They keep the naked wizards from leaving the kelp forest to attack other swimmers when they arrive. They would never betray—" "Why are you telling me this?" The furry wizard chuckled softly. "Though I breathe air, I do not side with their cause. They do not understand that if the water breathers die, the world will end." He smiled in resignation. "Little one, I tell you because I'm not really going to eat you." With that, the wizard closed his eyes and buried his teeth deep into the sitter's pulp, letting its juices spill out into his mouth. Feldper felt a warm surge of fluids pouring over its exterior as they exited its body and waited to sink into darkness. But it did not sink into darkness. Rather, it sank back into the ocean as the wizard's body darted past, limp in the mouth of a skybreaker. Feldper fell, stopping painfully on the sandy ocean bottom. It was dying, mortally wounded. Something would come along soon enough and pick it clean. Only the agony of a slow death awaited it now. "At least that scruffy wizard got what he deserved." The kelp drifted back and forth around Feldper softly. Their songs were the sitter's only comfort. It had only 3 quills left protruding from its quivering pink and gray flesh. One was half broken in half and dangled by a stringy thread. Slowly the songs of the kelp grew louder. Shafts of light, reflecting off 100 submerged leaves, danced across its broken body. The echoes of generations past rattled through the forest. Feldper gradually became aware of a distinct sound again, a single solitary song, a lone voice piercing through the jumbled gibberish. Perhaps it was just another furry carnivore come to finish it off? It waited, but nothing came. The tangible tone that had worked its way into the sitter's brain grew louder, more incessant, like a chant now. Higher pitched, mysterious melodies sounded in the distant recesses of its mind. Though it lacked any specific visual organ, the sitter was sensitive to light and recognized that some bizarre light show was being played out upon its crippled body. It felt as though it were being stretched, pulled, torn. Was it being eaten? No, it was not a physical sensation, but something strange on the outskirts of consciousness. It knew it was barely clinging to life. This must be death. The now blaring song of the forest grew to a deafening cacophony, like an irreverent dirge ushering it out of this life. The sand and sea surrounding it swirled up torrentially. The luminous beams continued to flash on Feldper in ever-accelerating patterns. The sand stuck to its wounds, entered into it. What is happening? It swirled and spun in an uncanny current, just above the ocean floor, growing horribly dizzy. The confusion and disorientation built tenfold. This wasn't death, but change. The final note of the chaotic symphony blasted in its brain. He opened his mouth and cried out. A monstrous shriek rang across the waters for miles. All fell silent. The orchestral din of the kelp forest had died. The disorientation ceased. He waited for his bearings to return, then lifted his eyelids. Reflected light from 1,000 objects shaped by refractions, altered by pigmentations, showered into his open eyes, temporarily blinding him with shock. The absolute assault on his senses nearly caused him to pass out. The power of the greens, the aquamarines, and the blues stunned him. The sheer grandeur of the alien ocean panorama brought about deep emotional stirrings within him. He had always been aware of the beauty of the marine waterscape, but never had he seen it. He had opened his eyes. His eyes! How was this possible? He had vision. Vision? He had eyes. He swam in a circle instinctively. It was faster than he had ever moved in his life. He realized that he was now identifying himself as he, rather than it. Why was he doing that? And yet it was true. Somehow he had been designated male. It was not simply a state of mind or a personal decision. It was a completely biological mandate. He had no question of it and knew it was right. All swimmers knew their distinctions were permanent and correct. They even believed that to fight against this nature led to meaningless and irrational babblings. The swimmers had a sort of sociology of their own, but it was one that embraced nature's decisions. Feldper struggled to understand. He had gone through a metamorphosis and become something new. Perhaps he was simply a swimmer now? But why? How? He sensed the ocean now in new and indescribable ways. The soft sounds of air bubbles fleeing to the ocean sky entered his consciousness. Additional receptors along his body began picking up electrical pulses from living things around him and their movements in the water. He found himself acutely aware of everything within a great distance around him. The distant melody of a sea mammoth hummed sweetly. He began to glow with an inexpressible joy, experiencing his home in a way he could never have comprehended before this change. The euphoric sensory display crowded his brain, allowing him to only scarcely notice the rising kelp beneath him and the lowering kelp above him. He closed his eyes and breathed the water in deeply, smelling it, tasting it. The kelp snapped together around him like a leafy prison. He opened his eyes, suddenly aware of the stealthy entrapment that had plunged him into darkness. There was room around him to swim, but no more than the length of his body in any direction. He groped at the kelp walls on either side of him in an involuntary survival instinct. While still recovering from the shock of his great transformation, he ran his appendages across the entire enclosure. He was sealed tight, cut off from the outside world completely. A dim light gradually emanated from the walls, dispelling the darkness of his entrapment and reflecting 1,000 shades of green on Feldper. Then something spoke. "Feldper, most of your life you have accompanied me, telling me of your ancestors, telling me of oceanic events, telling me of yourself. You have been so dutiful in friendship." "Who speaks?" Feldper demanded, losing patience with his constantly changing environment. "I am the elder Kelp. You have always called me the Grand Kelp, but in Kelpate my name is Ansir. But I suppose a more appropriate question would be, who are you?" Who am I? Well, I'm Feldper." "Well, you were Feldper," Ansir answered, "but you look like something else to me now." What am I now, then?" asked the creature that was once Feldper. "Well, you're you," Ansir replied quickly. "And what is that?" "Whatever you want." "I'm not whatever I want. I'm something." He glanced down at his unfamiliar anatomy. "I need to know." "Do you now?" "Of course I do." "Then why don't you ask your Sea King? He's always trying to classify his subjects. You've trapped me here, called yourself my friend, and all you do is make light of my questions. They are important questions." He shifted in the water uncomfortably, awkwardly attempting to adapt to his new center of gravity. Ancir waited several moments before responding. Of course they're important questions, my dear friend. We all want a sense of self. You was something else, and you had a name, and now you're something new. Though not someone new. But I shall give you a new name, one that better suits you. It was you who changed me, wasn't it? Not that it matters, but yes. And why have you trapped me here? So I can eat you. Ancir burst into hysterical laughter. Kelp don't eat swimmers. Ah, Ancir sighed deeply as though his laughter had reduced him to tears. You're right, we don't. But I never said you were a swimmer either. Again he exploded into chuckles. The confused new creation floated impatiently, suspended inside a presumptuous comedic plant. Ancir's jovial laughter stopped abruptly. You used to have such a good sense of humor before I changed you. Changed me into what? Into what? There you go again, Ancir moaned wearily. I'm sorry. It's just that someone already tried to eat me once today. Ancir's mood turned gentler. I know, and I'm sorry. I shouldn't have joked. I've trapped you here so we could speak privately. Not a soul can hear us beyond this encasement. We're hidden from both water and air breathers. Hidden from the world, as it were. A new memory sparked of a now dead furry wizard. What did he tell you? Ancir asked warily. Of a war. What war? Between air breathers and water breathers. When? Ancir's voice grew anxious. I don't know. What else did he say? There will be many casualties, and the Skybreakers are going to betray us. His own voice trembled as he began to ripen with fear. Ancir's questioning suddenly seemed to validate the mad wizard's ridiculous claims, and the Grand Kelp's alarmed reactions only terrified him more. You must go now and tell your king of this treachery. I have given you the ability to reach him. Use my name to gain his trust. Few know it. Ancir grew solemn. While we've thus been speaking, the kelp forest has been overrun with Skybreakers in search of you. Tell no one of your transformation. As we've spoken, a troop of naked wizards has emptied the forest floor of your kindred. I'm sorry, but they must believe that you perished with your brethren. The furry wizard who spoke to you was a defector and my friend. You have confirmed my suspicions. Too many have fallen this lightness already. Now go. The green light faded, and the impenetrable walls cracked open. Wait! The reluctantly freed prisoner cried. His mind was overwhelmed with the devastation of hearing his colony had been destroyed. But one question persisted. What am I? The former Feldperk pleaded. Ancir's fading voice echoed back. I name you Nestath! The leaves unraveled and straightened back up toward the ocean sky, releasing Nestath back into open water. Immediately, 2 Skybreakers were upon him. He burst forward in a rush of blinding speed, spinning and tumbling to confuse his pursuers. They snapped at his whip-like tail, which he had only begun to realize existed. One connected and ripped at it with flesh-piercing teeth, sending Nestath into an adrenaline-powered rage. He twisted his tail inside the attacker's mouth, turning him upside down, then flipped backwards with mechanical accuracy and crashed the full force of his body into the disoriented Skybreaker, who drifted away, motionless. Nestath blasted ahead, one assailant down, the other now following at a vengeful pace. He shot up, dipped, and dove in an amazingly gymnastic escape attempt, but the furious air breather remained menacingly close. The cold ocean water rushed across Nestath's giant body faster than he had ever felt. An idea formed in his now highly complex brain. As a newly budded sitter, he had listened to his parent undulate tales of watery caverns that descended the length of 100 sea mammoths. Of course, as a sitter, he never dreamed of seeing them. In a sitter's entire lifetime, it might only travel the distance of half of a sea mammoth, but that was if it was in a terrible hurry. He once traveled as if rolling in slow motion. He could see each sand particle as he approached it. Now the sea bottom sped beneath him too quickly to distinguish any one feature from another. He was gradually becoming aware of two sensory organs protruding from his head. He let out a short series of high-pitched shrieks. The shrill sound waves emanated from his vocal cords, reverberated off diverse marine surfaces, bouncing off both organic and geologic formations. The sound reflected back to Nestath's two cranial prongs, translating into a mental three-dimensional image of the waterscape. This sonar-like interchange with his environment and his preceding scream were inaudible and imperceptible to the skybreaker, still following him in a mindless frenzy. The auditory map Nestath had created indicated an enormous hole in a distant rock wall. He could not gauge its total depth, but it appeared to be deep enough. He was surprised by his new and uncanny abilities. The sheer strength of the blow he had dealt to his pursuer's fallen comrade might have crushed its ribs, possibly even collapsed its spinal column. However, it was a lucky shot. This one would not be shaken as easily. He still feared facing it head-on, for its mouth was far larger than his own. The remaining skybreaker swam upward, arching its back through the ocean's sky, spent air spewing from a circular hole in its head before sucking down another breath. It dropped back into the ocean and again took up chase with renewed energy. Nestath led it to the massive rock wall he had sensed with the marvelous beacons on his head. He slipped through the great crevice, and the skybreaker followed relentlessly. They traveled downward inside the hole, now revealing itself to be a steep chasm inside an oceanic mountain. Nestath could then sense the cave's true depth. It would be more than sufficient. He was impressed by the skybreaker's determination and felt a twinge of guilt at its pending demise. If only it would turn around and abandon its murderous intent. But still it pushed downward in blind hatred, even after the light from above could no longer reach them. About halfway into the descent, Nestath sensed his attacker suddenly stop, bubbles escaping from its air socket. The fool! It had run out of air, a world away from the ocean sky. Nestath continued downward, hoping to bring his super-sensitive hearing out of range of the creature's gurgling panic. The dying skybreaker scrambled upward desperately. It smashed into walls, searching for an exit, but the darkness hid the way. Nestath was unable to swim far enough to avoid the sickening sounds of its last frantic movements.